At my birthday dinner, my parents couldn't stop raving about my cousin's recent promotion. They handed me a gift card and said, "We didn't have time to get you anything special." I forced a smile, pulled out my phone, and replied, "That's okay, I just bought myself a new car." The table fell silent. The restaurant buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd, the clinking of silverware and muffled conversations blending into a background that should have made the evening feel warm and lively. Instead, it felt like just another stage where I was expected to play my part and smile through the neglect. I sat at the long, polished wooden table surrounded by my family, forcing myself to sip my lukewarm water while my mother went on and on about Emily's big promotion as if it were the most significant achievement in the world. Emily, my cousin, younger by 4 years but somehow always the center of attention, sat across from me with a smug little smile, nodding along as my mother praised her hard work and determination, as though she had clawed her way to success from the depths of struggle instead of riding the wave of favoritism that had cushioned her entire life. I barely heard the words anymore because I had heard variations of them for years, and by now, they all blurred into the same dismissive sentiment: Emily mattered, and I didn't. My father, sitting stiffly at the head of the table, barely made eye contact with me as he sipped his whiskey, occasionally nodding in agreement with my mother's glowing monologue. My aunt and uncle, Emily's parents, beamed with pride, chiming in with anecdotes about Emily's brilliance since childhood. Even my other cousin, Rachel, whom I barely spoke to outside of these forced family gatherings, had more to say about Emily's promotion than she ever had about my accomplishments. It was my birthday, and yet here I was, watching the people who were supposed to love me barely acknowledge that fact. I had been through this routine before, but tonight something inside me felt different. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the years of swallowing my pride, or maybe it was the cold realization that I no longer cared enough to pretend anymore. I had spent so many years trying to be seen, to be good enough to be the son and nephew they would be proud of, but what had it ever gotten me? A seat at a table where I was an afterthought. "Marcus, are you even listening?" My mother's sharp voice cut through my thoughts, making me blink and look up. I forced a tight smile, my fingers tightening around my fork as I nodded. "Of course," I said, though I hadn't caught a single word of whatever had been said. My mother sighed dramatically, shaking her head as if I had just failed some invisible test. "I was saying it's just so inspiring to see Emily achieve so much at such a young age. She's always been so driven, you know? It reminds me of when she was in high school and won that state competition." "Do you remember that, honey?" she asked, turning to my father. He nodded absently, swirling the ice in his drink. "Of course, she's always been a go-getter." I felt my stomach twist, not with sadness, not with longing, but with something sharper, something colder. It wasn't just that they ignored my accomplishments, it was that they didn't even see me. It wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they had never cared. The waiter arrived with the food, setting down plates of steaming entrees, and for a moment, the conversation shifted to something as mundane as portion sizes and sauce preferences. I focused on cutting my steak, methodically slicing through the tender meat, taking small, deliberate bites as I counted down the minutes until I could leave. Then, just as I had resigned myself to another birthday spent fading into the background, my mother reached into her purse and pulled out a small, brightly colored envelope, sliding it across the table with a casual air that made it clear this was an afterthought, an obligation rather than a heartfelt gesture. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she said, her tone breezy and distracted. "Didn't have time to get you anything special, but I figured you could get yourself something nice." I looked at the envelope, at the cheap, mass-produced design on the front, at the way my mother didn't even meet my eyes as she handed it over, a gift card, not even wrapped, not even with a note. She didn't even bother to ask if I liked it because it wasn't about me, it was never about me. I heard Emily snicker under her breath, and that was the moment something inside me snapped, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in the cold, calculated realization that I was done playing their game. I set my fork down carefully, wiped my mouth with my napkin, and took the envelope had. I had grown tired of their disregard for me in favor of the cousin they had deemed more deserving of their attention. By the time I reached college, I had stopped expecting anything different. I had trained myself to smile and say thank you, even when I felt invisible. I convinced myself that it was better to be independent than to beg for scraps of love from people who were never going to give it freely. When I graduated with honors, I held out the faintest hope that maybe, just maybe, my family would recognize the significance of it. But instead, my parents skipped the ceremony entirely, claiming they were too busy helping Emily prepare for a summer internship. It felt like a slap in the face, one I swallowed down with a bitter smile. The real insult came later when I discovered they had thrown Emily a going-away party with catered food and balloons, as if her landing a standard summer internship was a grander accomplishment than my years of hard work toward a degree. That was the moment I truly understood that nothing would ever change. No matter how hard I worked or how successful I became, I would always be an afterthought to the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I learned to stop sharing my victories with them, to stop looking for pride in their eyes, to stop hoping for the kind of love that came so easily for Emily. When I bought my first home, a charming little place with a wraparound porch and a beautiful backyard, I hesitated before telling my parents, waiting to see if, just this once, they would surprise me. But my mother simply hummed over the phone, barely paying attention as she rattled off some excuse about being too busy to visit. A week later, she and my father drove 3 hours just to take Emily shopping for furniture for her new apartment. So when I sat at that birthday dinner, listening to my mother sing Emily's praises as if the world revolved around her, something inside me went still. It hardened into a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. I had played the role of the overlooked son for long enough. I had accepted their indifference for too many years, and now, for the first time, I was no longer willing to sit quietly and accept the crumbs they threw my way. Buying the car hadn't been about proving a point, at least not to them, but rather a statement to myself that I was done waiting for validation from people who had never cared enough to give it. I had made my own success, built a life entirely separate from their approval. When I saw the stunned expressions on their faces at the dinner table, the absolute shock that I had done something significant without their input, I felt something close to satisfaction. But I wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about a car or a single birthday dinner, it was about a lifetime of being underestimated, about every moment I had been pushed aside, about every time they had failed to see my worth. For the first time in my life, I was ready to make them see exactly what they had ignored for so long. I sat at the dinner table, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me, enjoying the way my mother's face twisted with something between confusion and discomfort, the way my father furrowed his brow as if he were trying to piece together some puzzle he hadn't even realized existed until this very moment. Emily, predictably, was the first to speak, her voice carrying that same condescending lilt she had used all our lives whenever I did something that made her feel even slightly threatened. "You?" Emily scoffed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the stem of her wineglass as she tilted her head, her lips curving into a smirk that barely masked the flicker of insecurity in her eyes. "A new car? Must be a used one, right?" I didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't give my cousin the satisfaction of seeing even a trace of irritation cross my face. I had spent years perfecting the art of keeping my emotions hidden behind an easy, unreadable expression. Instead, I simply let my lips curl into a slow, deliberate smile, the kind that was just enough to unsettle Emily without giving her anything to latch onto. "Oh no," I said, my voice smooth and steady, my fingers wrapping around the stem of my own glass as I took a small, measured sip. "Brand new, actually. Right off the lot. Fully loaded, every feature you could imagine." I figured, why not treat myself for once? The silence that followed was thick enough to cut through, heavy with unspoken questions, barely concealed resentment, and the dawning realization that I had done something none of them had expected. Emily's smirk faltered, her fingers tightening around her glass, her carefully crafted confidence slipping for just a second before she recovered, forcing out a dry, humorless laugh that was meant to sound dismissive but instead came off as strained. I said, setting my glass down with a quiet clink, my gaze flickering back to Emily just in time to catch the way her jaw clenched. "I've been doing pretty well for myself lately. Figured it was time to enjoy the benefits of my hard work." Emily's eyes narrowed, suspicion flickering behind them because she knew me. She knew I wasn't the type to flaunt, wasn't the type to seek validation, wasn't the type to throw money around just for the sake of it. If I had made a move like this, it meant there was something more beneath the surface, something bigger, something Emily couldn't quite put her finger on. That uncertainty was enough to make her shift in her seat, enough to make her rethink whatever condescending remark she had been about to spit out. I could feel the shift in the air, the tension thickening around us, the weight of the realization settling over them like an unspoken truth they weren't ready to confront. I wasn't the same Marcus they had always known. I wasn't the quiet, forgotten son who accepted whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. I wasn't the passive, overlooked man who smiled through their indifference and pretended it didn't bother me. No, this time was different because this time I had a plan, and none of them saw it coming. I wasn't surprised when my mother finally called me, though I took my time before answering, letting the phone ring a little longer than necessary. I savored the idea that for once, they were the ones waiting on me instead of the other way around. I had been expecting this call ever since the dinner, ever since I had watched their faces tighten with barely concealed jealousy, ever since Emily had scoffed and tried to belittle my purchase, ever since my father had given me that scrutinizing look, trying to figure out how his forgotten son had suddenly become someone worth noticing. Marcus, my mother's voice came through the line, breezy yet calculated, carrying that forced casualness she always used when she was trying to mask her true intentions. I was just thinking about you, sweetheart. How have you been? I leaned back in my chair, resting my feet on the edge of my coffee table, staring out the window as I let my mother's words settle between us for a moment before responding. I've been great, Mom. Really great, actually. Oh, that's nice to hear, my mother said, but there was an unmistakable hesitation in her voice, as if she was waiting for me to slip up, to give her something to latch onto, to confirm whatever narrative she had already constructed in her mind. I saw Emily the other day at your aunt's house, and she mentioned you got a new car. I have to say that's quite a surprise. I didn't even know you were looking for one. I smiled to myself because, of course, Emily had been the one to bring it up, and of course, my mother had chosen her words carefully, wrapping them in just enough doubt to make it sound less like praise and more like suspicion. Yeah, I figured it was time for an upgrade, I said, keeping my voice light, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make my mother uncomfortable. Well, my mother continued after a pause, her tone shifting slightly, moving into that territory where concern and condescension blurred together. I just wanted to check in, to make sure everything is all right. A big purchase like that can be a lot to handle, and I know you've always been, well, a little cautious with money. I let out a quiet laugh because I knew exactly what my mother was trying to do. I knew that this call was not about concern but about confirmation, about proving to herself that I had made a reckless decision, that I had overstepped, that I had tried to play in a league I did not belong in. But I had spent my whole life watching them underestimate me. I had spent years listening to them talk about me as if I were someone barely holding myself together. I had endured their backhanded comments disguised as advice, their subtle digs wrapped in concern, their perpetual belief that I was incapable of standing on my own. Well, you don't have to worry about me, Mom, I said, keeping my voice smooth, letting just a hint of amusement creep in. I can definitely afford it, and honestly, I figured I deserve something nice after the last few months. Oh? My mother's voice sharpened with curiosity because I rarely talked about myself, rarely offered up details about my life, rarely gave them anything to dissect. Something happened? I let the moment linger, let my mother wait, let her sit in the same kind of anticipation I had felt so many times before when I had waited for them to acknowledge me, to see me, to care. Silence, a silence so thick, so absolute, that I could almost picture the way my mother's face must have frozen, the way her fingers might have tightened around the phone, the way her entire body might have gone still with the sudden realization that for once, Emily was not the one at the center of the conversation. A promotion, my mother finally said, and I could hear the strain behind her words, the forced attempted enthusiasm, the barely contained shock. Well, that's surprising. I didn't bother pretending I didn't hear the hesitation. I didn't bother softening the edges of my words. Yeah, it's a big step up, more responsibility, bigger salary, a lot of new opportunities. Another pause, then right on cue, the backhanded remarks began. Well, money isn't everything, my mother said, her tone taking on that artificially wise quality she always used when she was trying to diminish something she didn't understand. I just hope you're not taking on too much. That kind of job can be really stressful, and you've always been a bit, sensitive to pressure. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the arm of my chair, feeling that familiar dull frustration bubbling beneath my ribs. They had always done this, had always acted as though I were fragile, as though I needed to be handled carefully, as though I wasn't capable of holding my own. It was infuriating in its predictability, exhausting in its persistence. But this time, it didn't hurt the way it once would have because I knew something they didn't. I had already won. I had spent my whole life waiting for them to acknowledge me, waiting for them to see me, waiting for them to care. But I no longer needed it, no longer wanted it, no longer cared about proving anything to them. My mother could downplay my success, could pretend it was not as impressive as it was, could act as if it was some temporary stroke of luck instead of the result of years of hard work. But none of that mattered because I wasn't seeking approval anymore. I was done explaining myself, and I wasn't finished yet. I had always believed that family was supposed to be an unshakable foundation, a place where love was given freely, where support was unconditional, where being seen and heard did not have to be earned like a privilege. But I had also learned through years of quiet disappointment and unspoken hurt that sometimes the people you called family were nothing more than ghosts who haunted your life, appearing only when it served them, offering nothing but hollow words and performative affection. I had spent too many years playing the role they had assigned to me, the one who was easy to overlook, the one who never demanded too much, the one who accepted whatever scraps of attention they chose to throw my way. But that version of me no longer existed, and I was done pretending that any of them deserved a place in my life. The call started slowly at first, a few missed calls from my mother, a short text from my father asking if I had a minute to talk, a vague, seemingly innocent message from my other cousin Rachel that said, "Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" I read them all, let them sit unanswered, let the weight of my silence hang in the air between us like an unfinished sentence they were too afraid to complete. I knew what they were doing, knew that they were trying to feel out just how far I was willing to take this, knew that they were expecting me to crack first, to cave, to slip back into the quiet, compliant son who would eventually come running back, desperate for their approval. But the truth was, I had never felt lighter in my life. For years, I had waited by the phone, had been the one to reach out, had sat through conversations where I was treated like an afterthought, had attended family gatherings where I was nothing more than a background character in the Emily show. But now, as I let their messages pile up, as I let their calls go to voicemail, as I ignored yet another invitation to some dinner I knew would end with the entire family gushing about Emily's latest achievement, I realized something I had never truly understood before: I did not owe them anything. I did not owe them my time. I did not owe them my explanations. I did not owe them a place in my life simply because we shared the same blood. The final call came late one evening, the screen lighting up with Emily's name, the one person who had not bothered to reach out until now, the one who had likely been watching from a distance, waiting to see how long I would keep up this act, waiting for the moment when I would finally fold and come crawling back like I always did. I let the phone ring, watched the seconds tick by, counted down in my head as I let it go to voicemail. Rachel asked if something was wrong with you, and now what? You're just ignoring everyone? What is this, some kind of tantrum? I exhaled slowly, staring at the city lights outside my window, letting the weight of the moment settle over me, letting myself feel the finality of what I was about to say. For years, I settled for scraps of love, I said, my voice unwavering, my words slow and deliberate. Now I don't need any of you. Emily went silent, and for a brief second, I thought maybe, just maybe, I would hear something real in her voice, something that wasn't defensiveness or irritation, something that resembled regret or understanding. But instead, Emily laughed, a cold, humorless sound that carried nothing but bitterness. "You're so dramatic," she muttered, and I could hear the venom dripping from every syllable. "Fine, be that way, but don't come crawling back when you realize how much you need us." I didn't respond, didn't waste another second of my time arguing with someone who had never once tried to understand me, never once cared to see beyond her own reflection. Instead, I simply pulled the phone away from my ear, scrolled down to Emily's name, and pressed block. Then I did the same for every single one of them: my mother, my father, my aunt, my uncle, my cousin Rachel, the entire family group chat. I erased them from my life as easily as they had erased me from theirs, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, I felt free. The night air was cool as I stepped outside, climbed into the driver's seat of my brand new car, rolled down the windows, and turned up the music, letting the sound wash over me like a cleansing wave. The city lights stretched out before me, endless and full of possibility, and as I drove away, I didn't look back. I had spent my entire life waiting to be loved the way I deserved. Now I was finally ready to love myself enough to walk away. 6 months later, I was sitting at my desk, reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant knocked on my door. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her expression unusually hesitant. "She's your cousin?" I felt my stomach tighten. "Emily?" "No, Rachel." I hadn't expected that. Rachel had always been peripheral, hovering in Emily's orbit like everyone else. I considered turning her away, but curiosity got the better of me. Send her in. Rachel looked different, thinner, more subdued than I remembered. She stood awkwardly in my doorway before I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "This is impressive," she said, glancing around my office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Vice President of Operations." I had no idea. "You never asked," I replied simply. She winced. "I deserve that." We sat in silence for a moment before she pulled something from her bag, a small, worn photo album. "I found this at Grandma's when we were clearing out her house. Thought you might want it." I opened it carefully, revealing pictures of me as a child, science fair victories, graduation moments I thought no one had bothered to document. My grandmother had been the only one who seemed to see me, but she'd passed when I was 15. "Why are you really here, Rachel?" She sighed. "Everything fell apart after you left. Emily's promotion, the company's restructuring, and she's being let go. Aunt Carol and Uncle John are getting divorced. Your parents, they're not doing well. They finally realized what they've done, but it's too late, isn't it?" I closed the album. It was always too late. They had decades to see me. "I know. Her eyes filled with tears. "I was complicit too. I never stood up for you. I'm sorry, Marcus." I didn't reply immediately. The satisfaction I'd expected to feel at hearing their lives were unraveling never came. Instead, there was just a quiet certainty that I'd made the right choice. "Thank you for the album," I said finally. "Emily wants to see you," Rachel blurted out. "They all do." I laughed softly. "Of course they do. Now that I'm successful, now that I've proven myself without them, suddenly I'm worth their time." "It's not just that." "It is exactly that," I interrupted. "For 30 years, I was invisible. Now they want to bask in the reflection of what I've built without them." Rachel nodded slowly. "I understand. But for what it's worth, I think they've learned something. Too late, obviously, but still."